Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll pay tribute to a grandmaster who passed away this year, and he was absolutely brilliant. In fact, he has been considered the #1 non-Soviet player back in the late 1960s, early 70s. At one point, even Bobby Fischer gave him a lot of recognition ahead of himself. Well, let's get started with this absolutely very brilliant game that Bent Larsen played. He started with his favorite opening that is in fact named after him, b3, the Larsen opening. Here, most commonly, Black would respond by placing one of his central pawns in the middle, d5 or e5, but in this game, Black thought, let me just be copycat for now, and that's what the Spanish grandmaster Juan Bellon played. White responded with bishop b2, which is a very normal move, and of course, Black also responded with bishop to b7 developing. So far both sides are playing developing on the side instead of occupying the center, which is not the traditional way to play. Came e3, and now Black played a somewhat weird move, playing f5, kind of in a Dutch style. We consider a Dutch opening when Black plays f5 after d4, c4 or knight f3 start. So Black kind of tries to play orthodox. Now the game became really interesting already. White played a tricky move by playing bishop e2. This move immediately aims to take advantage of Black's last move to next give a check with the bishop on h5, and if Black's only choice is to block that check with the g-pawn, then the rook in the corner would be hanging. Of course, we need to notice the fact that White's pawn on g2 was also hanging. Instead of the last move knight f6, which Black played in the game, Black could have captured the pawn on g2, and now White's idea was to check with the only response to block the check, and now not yet capture the rook in the corner immediately, but play a very brilliant move, bishop f3, kind of protecting the rook in the corner, attacking the enemy rook in the corner, and if bishop takes, and now one of these unusual situations when both the Black rooks are hanging in the corner, and Black will lose one of those two rooks. So Black did not go for this trap, but played instead knight f6, which is the standard response, and now the game took a special turn, namely that White traded on f6. And this is a clear strategical plan to create double pawns for Black, and as you shall see, Black will have serious trouble in finding coordination between his own pieces. Just for a moment, let's touch on the check with the bishop on h5, which of course White could have done, but now already Black can block the check because the knight has developed to f6. So the game continued with bishop takes. Now of course it's absolutely suicidal to take back with the g-pawn when White would checkmate right away, so therefore the e-pawn has to take back by default. And now White played bishop f3. Basically what White is shooting for is to trade those bishops, and in this case if Black would trade immediately, then White would take back with the queen with an immediate double attack on Black's rook and pawn on f5. So it's pretty much not recommended to do that for Black, and that is why Black needs to save his bishop any way he can. If Black would play d5 right now, White could have the option to play c4 right away, and now c6 wouldn't be a good idea because then Black would be stuck with an isolated pawn on d5. So therefore Black developed knight c6, and with that protecting the bishop on b7. And now white could play various moves, c4, d4, all completely reasonable moves, but I like Larsen's move, simply develop. Now you shall see how unfortunate the black dark squared bishop is. It really cannot find any good squares, good potentials where to develop to. Black played g6, not that this helps the solution of the bishop, because imagine if that bishop ends up on g7 in the next moves, what does the bishop do there? Well, I have news for you, nothing. Here again white has numerous decent moves, but white chose a very good plan in delaying to castle, one of those rare situations when it's indeed a good idea to delay castling. White played c4 for now, and black responded with bishop d6. Certainly an awkward looking move, but as I mentioned in the previous comment, putting the bishop on g7 looks even worse. At least the good news is that even though the bishop is on d6 now in front of the d7 pawn, since the bishop already, the other bishop, developed to b7, that d pawn really has no urgency to move at all. Now white finally completed the development of the minor pieces, played knight c3, and black castled. And this is an important momentum in the game, that white is delaying castling, actually is delaying it quite a bit, in fact never castled in the entire game. White's next move and plan is simply to restrict the mobility of black's bishop. White played a3 with the idea to then play b4, so the black dark squared bishop is even more restricted, and at the same time it opens up a nice square for the white queen on b3. If black would play a5, white would have an option to play knight b5. Black played rook e8, and white played b4. It's important to mention that the reason why white can afford to delay castling is that there is no chance in the foreseeable future to open any of these central files. So therefore, it's not a real issue, the safety of the king. In fact, the king is quite safe right in the middle. And of course, remember, the king is ready to castle at any point that they choose to. If in this position black would try to play f4, trying to get rid of his doubled pawn in view of the kind of pin situation here on the knight on e2, then white would not trade on f4 but immediately would play c5, a very tricky move, because if now black would accept this little sacrifice, that would be rather costly, the fork appearing with queen b3 check. Not a good idea. And of course, if after f4 and c5 the bishop retreats, let's say, to f8, then already the f4 pawn is hanging. So that explains black's next move, that was queen to c8, protecting the bishop on b7 and having in mind to play f4 next move. But of course, white has now the time to prepare for it, even though white still prefers not to castle and rather play d4. You can see how white is gaining space advantage in the middle of the board as well as on the queen side. Now, white is getting ready to gain even more space to chase the black pieces back even further by playing c5 soon. In fact, if black would play f4 right now, again, c5 is the trouble, chasing the bishop back, and then white could grab the pawn on f4 quite safely. Black continued with knight d8, hoping for the exchange of the light squared bishops. White, of course, in no rush whatsoever to do that, although white would maintain the space advantage and the advantage in general even after trading on b7 and castling. But white played c5, not in a rush to trade, and here white's strategy was that if black chooses to trade, white would just say thank you, because the g file gets opened, and if white plans to either move the king to d2 later or even castle to the queen side after a queen b3 check, the white rook from the queen side can move over to g1, and white will have a free hand to attack black's king on the g and h files. For example, if the bishop retreats, and let's say we give a check, and the king moves out, white can start the attack with h4 and h5, and then, as I mentioned, move the king out and get the other rook over to the king side as a potential plan. So let's go back all the way to the position where white played c5, and black chose not to trade, but to simply retreat the bishop to f8. And white continued with knight f4, a very good idea, getting ready if bishop takes bishop, having the option of capturing back with the queen or with the g-pawn. And black played king g7, getting out of that future queen b3 check. And here white needs to choose what to do next. Castle or not to castle, trade on b7 or not to trade. Well, white knows what they are going for, and it is black's king. A very typical attacking move, h4, trying to use the fact that the white rook is still in its initial position on the king side, which means that white gets the rook to be an active attacking piece without wasting a single move moving the rook. All white is doing is advancing the h-pawn, and then later tries to play h5 with the idea to open the h-file, as I said, to gain time optimizing the rook without even wasting a single move moving it. And black continued with knight e6 with the idea that less pieces, less trouble. The less pieces are traded, the less dangerous the opponent's attack is. Generally, that's a very true statement, but in many cases, just like in this game, it doesn't quite solve black's problem. White indeed traded. Now it would be suicidal to take back with the pawn. Quite a nice little bishop trap with c6, followed up by b5. So the black rook captured on e6 in the game. And here white played knight d5, although I personally like the immediate h5 move also quite a bit. Came knight to d5, and black retreated the rook. Rooks rarely belong in other places than the back rank, and now finally white was ready to push the pawn further. White could have chosen another course of action as well in playing rook c1, quite a good looking move, threatening to trade and win a pawn, forcing probably a further weakening in black's position, or a trade, in which case white's position is clearly superior again. Well, on the other hand, there was nothing wrong with h5 either. Quite a good move if white gets to open the h-file and then would succeed to get the queen to the h-file, black would face deadly troubles. One of the big difficulties in black's position here is that black is so passive with all the pieces on the queen side, and they have a very hard time, if not impossible, in getting over to the other side to the defense of black's king. If now black would play g5, white would certainly continue with h6 with major trouble for black, as now the black king needs to leave the protection of the f6 pawn, as if the king would go either to f7 or g6. Bishop h5 would cause a lot of trouble. So after h5, therefore black chose to trade the bishop for the knight. Bishop took back and black played c6. Another question is where to move the bishop back from the attack. And the correct square to go to is going back to a2. The reason why the bishop is better on a2 than it would be on other squares, because it is not in the white queen's way. One of the main plans that white has is to bring the queen to f3 and then to h3 and open the h-file somewhere along the way and checkmate black. Another plan that white has is to bring the queen to b3 and try to attack from that direction. And if the bishop would have gone to any other square other than a2, indeed the bishop would have been in the queen's way. Black played d5 right now to try to lock up that diagonal, but of course white has at his disposal to do en passant. If white would choose the other plan and tries opening the h-file and then bring the queen out, then black just on time would defend the position timely. So therefore white should do en passant as they did, and black captured back. And now white again has two game plans: to play on the king side or to play against black's weakness on the queen side, the c6 pawn, or maybe combine the two. So therefore rook c1 certainly was a reasonable move here also, but white's move is even more precise. Queen f3 also aims at the c6 pawn, while at the same time is getting ready to open the h-file and get the queen there to h3. And here black played a tricky move, trying to get counterplay, playing queen a6, attacking white's pawn on a3. If white would try to move the bishop now, trying to protect it that way, black would have the opportunity to win a pawn with bishop b4, so that's why that wouldn't really help. Now a decent move would be to indeed follow up with the attack. It's important to point out that white is delaying the trade of the pawns on g6 and the opening of the h-file to open it at his own terms. Like for example now, if black plays rook h8, then white could continue with queen h4, quite a nice move also, threatening with h6 and then grabbing the pawn on f6, and protecting that pawn with the rook would be even worse, checkmate immediately, quite nice. Or if the bishop protects, then white would play queen f4 with the idea to then enter to black's position from c7. So black was in a kind of difficult situation also after queen h3, but white chose to simply accept the pawn and take up the challenge, see what black will do next. Now the black bishop is hanging, so black protected the bishop with the rook, and now white is playing b5 in order to chase the queen away, the black queen away, from protecting the b7 square. That's what white would like to do, to check and then pretty much checkmate the black king. Right now black should have played queen to c8, even though in that case as well white is a pawn up and most likely would win the game. Black on the other hand chose to grab the pawn to equalize the material balance. Right now white has a number of decent ways to play, including checking on b7 when black is forced to block the check, and then white could even castle with a pretty strong position, although this is clearly inferior to what white did, a very unorthodox way of dealing with the situation by playing king e2. Just as the king was safe so far in the middle of the board, it is safe even on e2, or as you shall see, on f3. Quite a brilliant idea. If now Black plays rook a to c8. White would play queen d5, again trying to get into black's position. And if check, king f3. And now black has an opportunity to win white's queen, although it requires quite a bit of sacrifice. Takes, and then take the queen, takes, king h2, queen d5, 4, rook takes pawn, king h6. So this seems like a better choice, even though here white has a clear advantage as well. But there is of course hope for perpetual check. Therefore that was black's best chance. Black played instead check immediately, king f3, and played g5. Now white could check immediately with the queen, but chose to take care of business first. Remember, now it is black who is threatening to checkmate. Therefore white needs to defend, played g3, king h6, and now white simply went pawn hunting by playing bishop e6, going after black's f5 pawn. There's not much that black can do about it. Also, the bishop on e6 is pretty powerful, preventing the black rook from getting to c8. It's quite amazing how safe the white king is on f3, as black doesn't have a knight or a light squared bishop. Black continued with f4, pawn takes, and finally the white rook gets into the game as well, rook a to g1. Pawn takes, and rook b8, preventing queen b7. But now the queen comes from the other side, queen e4. White is threatening now to checkmate in 2 with rook g6 next. Therefore came f5. And now the simplest, safest move, queen h4, which threatens with checkmates on g5 or f6, and black is helpless. Quite an amazing game, how white simply dominated the game from the very early stages of the game on, in getting space advantage, in creating a double pawn for the opponent, and as you could see, black never created real coordination between his own pieces. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. I suggest you take a couple minutes to study this fascinating position and try to find ways, see how white can save the game. It's pretty amazing that there is only one single way how white can save the game. The trouble is that black has a far advanced passed pawn on g3, and even though white has the same, but if white tries to hold on to his own pawn, then the g-pawn runs away. Or, if we go back to the beginning, we try to come from g1, rook just takes the pawn, and again, it's trouble. There is only one way to save the game, and that is to play rook c5. Now, if the pawn advances, we just go behind the pawn, protecting our own and catching the opponent's pawn. Or, if rook takes, amazingly, still rook g5. And when rook takes, it is stalemate. Pretty impressive. Hope you enjoyed this beautiful endgame along with Larsen's masterpiece. And be back next week for some more chess ideas. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.